far should Ronald Acuna fall down the rankings? Is James Wood being overvalued? You've got outfield questions. We, hopefully, will have answers. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Thursday, November 14th. I am Frank Stampfl, who got the date right for once. That's great. Joined by Scott White and Chris Towers. Today on the show, we are taking an early look at 2025 outfield rankings, looking to get through the top 30 from both Scott and Chris. Will be comparing rankings, going back and forth, but let's just jump right in, see how many of these we can get through. We'll go through groups of three, keep this thing moving along here, and just start up top. The top three for Scott: Aaron Judge, Juan Soto, and Mookie Betts. You will never guess it. Chris has the same top three: Aaron Judge, Juan Soto, and Mookie Betts, which this feels pretty standard. All three are proven studs and first-round picks next season, regardless of format, categories, head-to-head points. It doesn't matter. Let me ask this. I'm in an early draft, NFBC. I took Kyle Tucker over Juan Soto. Did I get too cute? Is that too cute? What do you think, Scott?
Well, Kyle Tucker's number 4 for me.
So not that cute.
So there's that. I mean, obviously, you're talking about a roto league, and Kyle Tucker, we presume, provides steals, potentially as many as 30 of them, while Juan Soto will be lucky to get double digits, and that's a big deal in that format. Of course, if you're talking about a points leagues with all the walks, Juan Soto gets, it'd be a different story. But we're not. We're talking about a roto league. I mean, it's certainly not beyond all imagination that Kyle Tucker could be the second best outfielder in fantasy. He was kind of trending toward that, or it at least right up there with Juan Soto in terms of fantasy production before the what's it called? The shin injury.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's this. Yeah. I mean, I would have a hard time justifying that. Like,
I mean, it's just steals, right? That's the only.
Yeah. I'm a little bit more worried. I understand Juan Soto is like generational, Hall of Fame track, like all of that. I do worry, and there's data that does support, like, first year of a mega contract, it doesn't always go great. Now, Ohtani just went 50-50, so, you might be laughing at me for thinking that, but Bryce Harper, we saw his first year in Philadelphia. I know Lindor was a trade, but he got traded and then signed a massive extension. His first year in New York, not great. I mean, we've seen this time and time again, so it just wouldn't surprise me. And I think they're like close enough where, if you're using that as the reason to take Kyle Tucker, I'm fine with it, and that's why I did it. Or maybe I'm crazy.
No, I don't think you're crazy. It's comparing around the margins, right? It's not like they are in some different tier, really. It's just Kyle Tucker hasn't been as bankable and is coming off a year that he lost half of it to injury, and that always, I think, makes a player feel riskier. And maybe it was just a fluke thing, a stress fracture in the shin. It's not like he has an extensive injury history, so it's not crazy. I couldn't pass up Juan Soto after the year he just had, and like knowing who he is, and as much as he's on base, all the runs he's going to score, and everything else. Now, if he signs with San Francisco, maybe I drop him behind Kyle Tucker in my rankings.
Maybe.
But assuming he winds up in a neutral hitting environment or better, then I'm going to take Soto.
And Soto went 10th overall in a draft I'm doing. I got him at 10th overall. He went behind Kyle Tucker and Mookie Betts, in addition to Ellie De La Cruz. Jose Ramirez, I think that's defensible. Gunnar Henderson, a little less so. Paul Skeens, I will have that conversation at some point, but Paul Skeens being like 8 picks ahead of any other pitcher, I can't justify. I don't know. I think the Soto thing is just, and we mentioned it a little bit in a recent podcast, maybe the most recent one, but I think the market still thinks stolen bases are scarcer than they are.
Yeah.
And like I brought this up on Twitter a couple days ago that like I think Juan Soto should be the number 4 pick in pretty much every draft, or no later than number 4. Certainly in head-to-head points leagues, he should be maybe even higher. And someone said, "Yeah, but he's a 0 or close to a 0 in steals. He's a 4 category guy." And it's like, well, Ellie's going to go ahead of him in every draft. De La Cruz, not the elephant. And that's a little New York Liberty humor.
I got it, Chris.
And Ellie's a 3 category guy, kind of a 2.5 category guy. Like, he's okay in home runs, but he's not a difference maker there. He's a negative in batting average. Like, I think Juan Soto should definitely go ahead of Ellie De La Cruz, and I'm in the minority there, seemingly. So I do think like the 4 category guys. I think this includes Jordan Alvarez, certainly, especially the guys who are real benefits in batting average. I think batting average is probably a more difficult category to find than speed at this point. So if I'm going to worry about taking a 0 in the first round, I'd rather it be a 0 in steals than batting average.
Yeah, I've kind of been trending that way for a few years as the steals league-wide have ticked up, but I think we've certainly reached the breaking point with that, where batting average is the hitting category that is most essential to meet early.
Mm-hmm.
And stolen bases are available throughout the draft.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, stolen bases are more available throughout the draft than home runs are. So you could make the case that home runs are more critical to fill early than stolen bases. But it's been decades since that's been true. So it's people are just kind of pre-programmed to, oh, he's not giving me steals, I can't use my first round pick on him. The people who thought that way, I mean, obviously Juan Soto's been a first round pick in the past, but there are some people who just aren't willing to do that with a first round pick.
Let's move on to outfielders 4 through 6. And for Scott, the aforementioned Kyle Tucker, Corbin Carroll, and Fernando Tatis. And for Chris, it's Kyle Tucker, Yordan Alvarez, and Fernando Tatis. So Corbin Carroll a little bit lower here for Chris. Again, it's like splitting hairs. You know, Scott has Carroll a little bit higher than Alvarez and Tatis, and Chris has him a little bit lower. I mean, is there anything to that you guys need to defend as to why? Or
I think Scott is, from our conversation in the previous podcast, a little bit more confident in Corbin Carroll bouncing back in batting average. I do think there's a chance that Corbin Carroll is just kind of a drag in batting average. So that I think is mostly the gap between us, but it's 2 spots. And I think you have Fernando Tatis a couple spots lower. How much lower? Oh, no. Carroll, it's Yordan Alvarez.
Yeah.
Is who I have in the top 6, and you have Yordan Alvarez 8th. It's 2 spots either direction. I don't think it really makes a big difference. It's just I think Scott's a little more confident that like the second half, because I think it's the second half, he was the number 2 outfielder and he hit 256, I think is the stat. And I'm a little less certain that 256 is like a negative outlier for Corbin Carroll. I think that might be more what he is. He was a 268 XBA in 2023, 247 in 2024. I think he might just be a 260 hit.
Well, if we're doing the comparison, Corbin Carroll, like if that's where what we're kind of describing our, if that's our frame of reference for Yordan Alvarez, Corbin Carroll, then I would say the distinction there, yeah, I mean maybe Corbin Carroll's kind of mid outcome is 260, but I think he could hit 280 potentially or higher. I don't think he's going to be a batting average liability the way Ellie De La Cruz, let's say, could. And obviously, Yordan Alvarez is going to be an asset for batting average. But let's get back to the stolen base comparison here, because Kyle Tucker versus Juan Soto, we're talking you're missing out on 20 to 30 steals potentially. Corbin Carroll versus Jordan Alvarez, you're missing out on 30 to 50 steals potentially. So it's a much bigger gap there. Corbin Carroll is not just a help in stolen bases. He could be one of the most impactful players in that category. So if we're going to do that Corbin Carroll versus Jordan Alvarez thing, that's where I land on that. But just speaking more generally about Alvarez, because I originally had him ranked similarly to you, Chris, because I'm not putting the same emphasis on stolen bases that others are. I'm putting more of an emphasis on batting average. But the thing about Jordan Alvarez that separates him from a Juan Soto is you got to factor in an IL stint. He's a burly guy whose knees have been an issue for him in his early to mid 20s. And he'll probably never play 150 games in a season. He might only play 125. And that's going to limit his RBI and run production at a point in the draft where you want to get about 200 of those. He's more likely going to give you 170 to 180. And so that's the biggest reason I'm knocking down Jordan Alvarez. But he's a stud. Again, we're what was the phrase I used before? Comparing on the margins or something like that. Because it's not like Jordan Alvarez is a bad pick at the round 1-2 turn.
The tyranny of small differences. That's a thing people say, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what context they say it in, but that applies here, I'm surely.
Scott, you mentioned that, excuse me, Alvarez is likely to miss time. I think you could say the same thing for Fernando Tatis, right? He missed a chunk of time.
That one.
All right, so tell me why.
Well, so like Jordan Alvarez, it's recurring issues that crept back up last year. He did miss some time with a knee injury last year for the first time in a while. The previous couple of years, because remember, he had, I think 2020, he had surgery, I want to say, on his knees, and the knee issues mostly went away. And then I think he had a bit of a knee issue this year in his right knee. Before, he also had like an oblique at one point, I think, and like that is more concerning. I think when you're talking about recurring injuries, Fernando Tatis, it was recurring shoulder injuries and then the wrist from a motorcycle accident. Right? Am I getting these details correct? Please feel free to
that sounds right.
Famously bad memory. Then he gets surgery on both the wrist and shoulder. 2023, I don't think he missed any time with injury, right? The only time he missed in 2023 was when he was coming back from the
suspension.
Yeah. And then last year he has this fibula stress reaction that is totally separate from everything that he struggled with in the past. And that's not to say that can't be an issue moving forward. A stress reaction would seem to indicate that there's some kind of but like the fact that it was just a completely different injury, I don't worry too much about that. Just like I'm not holding Kyle Tucker having basically the same thing against him. A bone injury, that should heal. Like we've been doing bones for thousands, maybe millions of years as a species. We know how to handle that. A torn labrum, like surgery to repair a torn labrum, that's like 70 years. I have no idea if that's true, but we'll say it's true. So like that to me is Fernando Tatis. I actually don't have that much injury concern around him. That being said, I have said this about many players who have gone on to suffer recurring injuries in the past. I don't know. That's just my internal model.
Mm-hmm. And Tatis was still really good. He had 21 home runs, 11 steals, 833 OPS. Obviously hasn't been as good as before all the surgeries and suspensions and everything. So we're still kind of waiting to see that like elite number one player upside. For what it's worth, he went insane in the playoffs in a really small sample size. So hopefully the further we get away from those surgeries, suspensions, yada, yada, if we can get a full season out of Tatis, maybe we can get that, 40-20 type season or something like that.
Yeah, and I felt underwhelmed by his production the past couple years. I almost want to rank Tatis lower, but then you look at that StatCast page. He was one of the
so good
biggest underachievers by the StatCast data, Expected batting average 304 versus the 276 mark he hit. Expected slug 554 versus the 492 mark. And those expected stats, those are 95th percentile or better. It's a bit like what we saw from Vladimir Guerrero the previous couple years, where he had a reputation as an elite level hitter and but wasn't meeting those StatCast marks, and then suddenly he was again. And Fernando Tatis, with his history and still being in his mid-20s, I think there's a very good chance he bounces back with that. I don't want to overpay for him, but I think we're being careful not to do that by ranking him only 6th in the outfield.
I wonder if there's something in the profile of Tatis, the way he hits the ball, that causes him to underperform. And I know I think there was a few articles that came out the past couple of years that he mostly hits his fly balls to center field and like the power alleys. Mm-hmm. And maybe because the ball hasn't been traveling as well the past couple of years, that's why he's kind of underperforming these expected stats. But there was someone much smarter than me who broke it down. I believe on Fangraphs, there were a couple articles about it. So if you search out Fernando Tatis and on Fangraphs and look up those articles, you might be able to find a reason why. I'm just kind of, speculating, trying to figure out why is he underperforming so much.
Just looking at his Fangraphs page, his highest pull rate was in 2021, the ridiculous season. And then in 23 and 24, among his lower pull rates, in 2024, it was his lowest pull rate of his career. So yeah, I mean, he could stand to pull the ball more, but that's something that we see hitters adjust all the time. So I'm not really worried about it.
I would just also point to Juan Soto and Vladimir Guerrero as examples of guys that we were like, oh, there's a reason they're underperforming their StatCast data. And it's like, well, until they didn't, right? And like Soto changed teams, and that might explain it, right? It might just be a Petco Park thing. Petco Park might just be an especially tough place specifically for like elite hitters to perform at. We've seen that Adrian Gonzalez for a long time underperformed at Petco Park. So I'm not writing it off entirely, but like Scott said, that's a reason to rank him 6th instead of like 4th.
All right. A quick reminder that you can always listen to FBT and FBT and 5 on Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, scan the QR code. That will take you right to the FBT feed on Spotify. And speaking of which, I know Spotify Wrapped will be released soon. It gives you all a bunch of stats on the podcast you've listened to from the past year. So make sure to tweet us your Spotify Wrapped graphics. Once those are out, bosses love that kind of stuff and, makes us feel good about ourselves. So yeah, let us know how much you listened to FBT this past year. We'll take our first break, and when we return back into the outfield ranks, we'll do that right after this.
Welcome to JJ's.
I'll have wait, there's no way I can get a burger?
No chance, but you can have the NFL on CBS streams live on Paramount Plus. Oh, hang on. There's a toy.
Welcome back in, and we will continue on with our outfield rankings. And 7 through 9 for Scott, we have Julio Rodriguez, Yordan Alvarez, and Jarren Duran. And for Chris, it's Corbin Carroll, Julio Rodriguez, and Ronald Acuna, who Scott has down at 12. We spoke about all the other names. Well, we spoke about Acuna a lot recently as well. But for Acuna, we know that he had surgery to repair the torn ACL in his left knee, and he won't be ready for opening day. That came from the mouth of Alex Anthopoulos. He had surgery on his right ACL back in 2022. So now both knees and legs have been operated on. He had that historic 2023, but he was off to a bad start before the injury this year. And I don't think that was related to any type of injury, or at least they didn't tell us that. He only hit 250. He had 4 home runs, 16 steals, and a 716 OPS. The K rate more than doubled. The quality of contact came way down. Chris, what do you make of just Acuna's struggles before the drastic knee injury that he suffered once again?
I don't really make much of it, to be honest. Like I didn't think there was a physical underlying explanation for why Ronald Acuna was struggling. Like clearly the strikeout rate moving in the wrong direction, that was a concern. And that is a good reason to think that 2023 was not a fluke. I don't want to say fluke, but a career year. It is unlikely that Ronald Acuna will do 2023 again. The improvements in his contact rate were gigantic and did not prove sustainable. So like, I don't think you should look at 2023 and say that's the expectation. It's possible though. And look, I think the case against him, right, would be 2022 coming back from the ACL, he struggled. He didn't hit the way he had the previous year. And now we have 2024 where he struggled to hit and is coming back from a torn ACL. I get it. I think those are reasonable reasons to be concerned. But when you're talking about this range of the draft, I know a lot of people say you don't want to mess it up. I mean, you can mess it up by taking Julio Rodriguez or Corbin Carroll, or like we saw that, like not in the same way where, Ronald Acuna is coming back from an injury, but like, I don't think either of those guys' seasons last year were dramatically better than Ronald Acuna's 2022. And I do expect him, like, he's not going to be back opening day. We'll see is my take on that. Like, we are 6 months away from opening day, roughly 5.5 months away from opening day. I think it's still too far away to say for sure that he can't make it back by late March, but let's say he can't. Does that mean he can't be back by early April?
Well,
or mid-April?
This is what concerns me, because I originally had Ronald Acuna second, and then I had him third. I was prepared to be bullish on Acuna for next year, and for what it's worth, I don't really think we can take anything like from his performance before he hurt the knee. Like if you looked at most any hitters' stats on May 26th of last year, you would come away unimpressed, and it's not even like we can use 2023 as a basis for comparison. Ronald Acuna last year through those 2 months wasn't doing like he had done at any point in his career. So whatever. I don't take anything from the performance last year, but what concerns me is that 6 months out from the season, Alex Anthopoulos, I read the quote 2 or 3 times. He sounded pretty definitive. We know he's not going to be ready for opening day. That's not the exact quote, but that's more or less the gist of it, which I found surprising because it is so far away. How can he say with that much confidence that Acuna, they don't think he's going to be ready to go for opening day? And if they can say 6 months out that they don't think he's going to be ready, I don't know that it's necessarily a thread the needle kind of situation where we think he's 6 months and 2 weeks away from playing as opposed to 6 months. The fact he was so definitive for it being so far out still, I found concerning. And I said Acuna, what he did through those first 2 months in 2024 was unlike the rest of his career. The one exception to that, 2022, when he came back from the first ACL injury and did not look right at the plate. His swing didn't look right. He wasn't able to launch the ball like we're used to seeing. And I wonder if they learned from that they brought him back too quickly and they just want to be – they really want to take their time with him this time. I don't know. I went from saying, okay, I don't know exactly what the timetable is, exactly what Acuna State's going to be for the start of 2024, but I know the upside is so high. And I know he had the ACL surgery so long ago that I'll rank him high and adjust down based on what we're hearing in spring training. And now, with that word from Alex Anthopoulos, I'm taking the opposite tact. I'm ranking Acuna cautiously, and I'm going to adjust up based on what we're hearing in spring training.
I do want to correct something that I said earlier. I read off the stats that Acuna had in the 49 games before he tore his ACL again. And I said, I don't think it was injury related before that. I did just remember that back in spring training, he was dealing with some knee soreness that shut him down for a couple of weeks. And, there was a little bit of a panic for a little bit there in fantasy about like, what is he still the first overall pick? I think in most leagues he was, but just, it was something that came to mind and maybe, he was dealing with that early on and then obviously had the torn ACL. So look, the Braves have two of the most prized assets in baseball, Ronald Acuna and Spencer Strider. They need to play it safe just for like the long term with both of those guys. So obviously they can be competitive for years to come. So we'll wait and see what we learn in the offseason. Outfielders 10 through 12 for Scott. We have the Jacksons, Chourio, and Merrill, and then Ronald Acuna down at 12. And then for Chris, it's Jarren Duran, Jackson Chourio, and Jazz Chisholm. So the only difference here is that Scott has Jackson Merrill ahead of Jazz, and Chris has it vice versa. Scott, why do you hate Jazz? No, you have them like one spot apart. So, but why do you prefer Jackson Merrill over Jazz Chisholm, I guess?
So the reason I moved Acuna, getting back to that, where I did 12th behind Jackson Chourio and Jackson Merrill, is because that's the point where I determined we're dropping from first-round caliber bats potentially to high-end bats, but not first-round caliber. I think Jazz Chisholm is outside of that discussion, given his injury history and given his limited ceiling with batting average. So I do think Jackson Merrill, as we talked about on the last podcast, does have the potential to produce like a first rounder because he's already he's just built for batting average, you know? To hit 292 as a rookie, he had an expected batting average of 308, 98th percentile. His expected batting average, low strikeout rate, good line drive rate. Just that is arguably the safest part of Jackson Merrill's profile, and it's the one that we were just saying a minute ago. That's the stat that's most critical to fill in the early rounds. Meanwhile, he had a combined 40 home runs and stolen bases, and this was, as a 20-year-old, didn't really get going until June. He kind of produced a hollow batting average before then, but most of his actual production came from June 1st on. And factoring all that in, the comfort level that's going to come from having already spent a year in the majors, I think it's very likely Jackson Merrill is just, we're having this conversation next year leading into 2026. I think it's very likely we are talking about him as a first rounder.
I agree with everything you said about Jazz regarding the batting average downside, the injury risk, 100%. Played a career high 147 games, hadn't played more than 124 before that. I also think he might have first round upside. Even if he hits 250 or 260, his 150 game pace once he went to the Yankees was 35 homers and 58 steals. Nobody is expecting that, but
and
I don't know that it's impossible either.
About half of that was spent playing through that elbow injury.
Yeah.
Remember, he rushed back from that elbow injury, and it affected his performance. But like, he put up those numbers while dealing with UCL damage in his left elbow, right? That was the injury. So like, that's where, for me, if I'm going to push guys up for stolen bases, you mentioned there being like a 30 to 50 steal gap between Yordan Alvarez and Corbin Carroll. Mm-hmm. It's probably not going to be that pronounced, but there could be a 30 steal gap between Jazz Chisholm and Jackson Merrill. Like, I think that is possible. The Yankees were surprisingly aggressive with Jazz Chisholm on the base paths. There's a reason we got excited when he got traded there, and then we saw it in action. We saw what we hoped to see from Jazz Chisholm. I think there's a chance he's batting leadoff for the Yankees next year too. I think we're all assuming Gleyber Torres is going somewhere else, not returning to the Yankees, and I think Jazz is probably the most likely full-time leadoff hitter, unless you really believe in Anthony Volpe. I don't know where they are on him at this point, but that could be a really good situation. I acknowledge the injury risk fully. That is a big drawback on Jazz Chisholm, and if you can't justify that price, I think that's perfectly reasonable. But I do think the 5, call it 4 categories, if you don't want to say batting average, potential there for Jazz is really, really high.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just note he had 74 runs and 73 RBI this past year, even with the Yankees.
He played most of his season with the Marlins.
Well, but even with the Yankees, his run and RBI pace wasn't good. He was batting 6th mostly, so you can kind of understand if he bats leadoff, that would certainly change expectations there. But I think Jazz Chisholm is from a 5x5 perspective. You give him good health. You assume he delivers close to his full potential. You're hoping for like Francisco Lindor production. And I do think Francisco Lindor, with his last 2 years, has put himself on the fringe of first round status there. But, just a year ago, we were drafting him late second round. So that's more what I view Jazz Chisholm as being than, with Jackson Merrill, we're talking about Kyle Tucker type upside, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. Outfielders 13 through 15 for Scott. We have Jazz Chisholm, Christian Yelich, and James Wood. And for Chris, we have Jackson Merrill, Luis Robert, and Michael Harris. So this is where we started to move into some differences in the outfield rankings. Scott has Yelich and James Wood a little bit higher. Chris has Luis Robert and Michael Harris a decent bit higher than where Scott has them. So let's just quickly go one by one with some of these names here. Yelich was awesome before he shut it down. Finally opted to have that back surgery. He's been dealing with back injuries for years now. The actual surgery he had was a microdiscectomy in August, which is a spine surgery that removes part or all of a bulging or herniated disc in the lower back. The recovery time was 3 months, so he should be fully healthy for the start of spring training. He'll also be 33 years old on opening day, and we just don't really know how Yelich will respond to this. We don't really, I don't think we have much of a track record for something like this. The early ADP has Yelich at outfield 29. Scott, you have Yelich at outfield 14. So much more optimistic view early on here.
Yeah. I guess everyone's just being careful about the back surgery, and backs can be tricky. Don't get me wrong. I don't really know how Christian Yelich is going to bounce back from this, but if he's Christian Yelich, if he's the Christian Yelich we saw last year, then I think he easily justifies this place in the rankings. I mean, he was looking like an MVP contender again before he got hurt. And the thing is, since his MVP 2018 season, near MVP 2019 season, the years since then were marred by this back issue that he's finally had corrected. So it could be a hindrance that he's coming back from back surgery, or it could be a huge boon to him, and we could see him improve even on last year's numbers because we see more of that power come back. He's a good base stealer. He's a good batting average. He's a source. He's going to score a ton of runs because he always gets on base a lot. And I think some of the past injury risk has been removed now that that bulging disc has been addressed.
Mm-hmm. James Wood was one of the top prospects in baseball last season and performed well in 79 games. He hit .264 with 9 home runs, 14 steals, a .781 OPS. Of course, he has his flaws. He's like 21 years old, so we're hoping that he continues to get better. Chris, you have him a little bit lower here. Do you maybe think we're overvaluing James Wood here early on in the process going into his second year?
I don't know if I would say we are. I mean, yeah, sure. I think top 15 outfielder. Personally, I think that's probably overvaluing him just relative to was he that much better than Dylan Cruz and Wyatt Langford and other similarly precocious outfielders who are much lower in the rankings and ADP right now? I don't really think so. I think you can look at it both ways. You can look at it and say, all right, this guy was on an 18 homer, 28 steal, roughly 80 run, 85 RBI, or 85 run, 80 RBI pace, while being very obviously not a finished product, right? Didn't elevate the ball, struck out way too much, swung and missed way too much, had a really inconsistent launch angle, hit a bunch of ground balls, didn't pull the ball. I think he had 2 batted balls in the air to the pull side the entire season or something like that. He was clearly just not a finished product, and yet he held his own. I think you can look at that and say, yeah, but once he does figure it out, look out. There's no guarantee he figures it out. And there are finished products with similar production profiles that are going behind where he is right now that I don't necessarily think it's worth the bet when there are so many interesting young outfielders this year. I think I would much rather take the bet on Cruz at a much cheaper price, or Wyatt Langford,
Lawrence Butler.
Lawrence Butler, who has a similar statistical profile.
You
Obviously,
prefer Butler to Wood?
No, but
Okay.
at cost.
Okay.
Yeah. You can
Yeah,
get. I mean, the
I think
early
I have
ADP,
Butler 5 spots behind.
you can get Butler 50 picks, so like double where James Wood is going right now.
So it just, I don't want to say he's entirely a mystery box, because like if all he does is what he showed last year, that's a solid player.
I mean, project
But
that
it's
over.
probably not worth this.
He played 79 games, so let's just double his stats. James Wood, 18 homers, 28 steals.
Yep.
82 RBI, 86 runs. So that's just projecting out what he's already done, even with the strikeout issues, even with the launch angle issues. And by the way, with those strikeout issues, with those launch angle issues, James Wood actually underperformed his expected stats. So you don't even have to project growth to be excited about James Wood. And it's very likely, given his prospect pedigree, and what often happens to this caliber of hitter in year 2, that there's considerable improvement. So, I'm consciously not trying to overvalue the kids this year. And I don't think I am by putting James Wood 15th in the outfield rankings. Plus, when it's a kid who already has to some degree proven himself in the majors, I think that's I think enthusiasm is more justified.
Isn't it crazy that we're calling James Wood a kid and he's like 6'7"?
I mean, he'd be that tall no matter how old he was,
Yeah.
I do want to like compare Wyatt Langford's final 79 games, because I would guess it's pretty close. And it is. Wyatt Langford's final 79 games, 255 batting average, 13 home runs, 12 stolen bases, 53 runs, 43 RBI. So less speed, more pop, similar batting average, better run production numbers. Like, at some point, aren't we just penalizing Wyatt Langford for getting to the majors 2 months ahead of James Wood?
Yeah, that's what I'm banking on, though.
What do you mean?
Well, where are they going relative to each other in early drafts? I don't want to put too much stock in that because I know that there are all the issues with the data, but
I was just going to say they're back-to-back in outfield rankings in ADP. Wood is the 16th outfielder.
About 15 spots overall.
Langford is 17, and they're going about 15 picks apart.
But you've got Langford
20th. I have Wood 15th and Langford 20th. So we're not talking an order of magnitude difference, but yeah, it does
I've got them 2 spots apart. That's my case for what Wood is mostly just I don't see the point in pushing him ahead of a similar guy. And I think Dylan Cruz rightly is behind them, but I don't know if he should be that much behind them either.
I mean, my thinking kind of is, okay, you need particularly a position like the outfield where there's so many redundancies, so many players who are basically same tier. You need to find ways to distinguish between them in forming rankings. I feel like Wood has all the sizzle right now. Wyatt Langford's post hype, and so I feel like I have to stretch a little more to get Wood, and Langford I can kind of let come to me. It would seem from the early ADP data that maybe I'm exaggerating that distinction between the two, the distinction in perception between the two. We'll see as draft season plays out, but I'd be more likely to move Langford up a couple spots than Wood down, I think.
I will say I'm probably just going to move them both up. I have them 22 and 24. I think I'll probably just have to move them up so that I can draft some of them.
Yeah, and that's a reminder that, again, this, your rankings are not set in stone. It's November 14th, so it's early in the process.
If you're noting a relative lack of conviction, These are very loosely held
Right.
opinions right now.
And I'm just the one picking them apart, and I don't even have any rankings myself yet. So
Must
who
be
am
nice.
I to be asking all the questions? Let's take our final break, and when we return, we'll hit some news and notes, then we'll get back into the outfield rankings. We'll do that right after this.
If you love football, this is the best time of the year.
This is as big as it gets.
The stuff of absolute dreams.
Welcome back in. Let's quickly hit on some news and notes. And the Angels are doing Angels things. They signed Travis d'Arnaud to a 2-year, $12 million contract. And this kind of sucks because d'Arnaud can still play. He just hit 15 home runs. He had a 739 OPS, solid barrel rate, still grades out as a solid defender. So the hope here was that d'Arnaud would go to a crappy team, which he did, but one where he could start. And that gives us another second catcher option for fantasy. But instead, he goes to a team where he's going to back up Logan O'Hoppe and likely play just enough to be annoying for Logan O'Hoppe's playing time. You can point to first base and DH. I don't see it because they have Nolan Chanuel, who is still young. I think he should get an opportunity to play.
And
And
he's
the
a
DH
starting caliber player at least.
And they have the DH spot for Soler, and I think Mike Trout needs more time at DH too. So I think all around this move kind of sucks for fantasy.
Yeah, you pretty much summed it up there. I have Logan O'Hoppe 10th at catcher. I'm probably going to move him down some. I still haven't quite figured out how far I want to move him down, but I was thinking O'Hoppe, one of the strengths of his was that he'd play around 75% of the time. A good workload for a catcher. Now I think it's going to be more like 60% with d'Arnaud there. And yeah, I didn't like knowing that d'Arnaud was probably leaving the Braves, but I thought, well, at least, he could get a true starting job somewhere, one of the many teams that needs a catcher. And of course he signed with one that doesn't really need a catcher. So it's frustrating on both ends.
Yeah.
The annoying thing is we went into this season thinking, or the off season thinking, well, the Angels probably can't have Mike Trout play center field full time. And I think they've talked about that, right? Like that's something that they've acknowledged. Like he probably needs to spend more time in a corner, maybe get some time at DH, blah, blah, blah. And then they go out and get Jorge Soler, which either makes it so he can't play DH at all, or they're going to play Jorge Soler in the field, which is a bad idea. And Trout has to play center field, or that's where they put him at DH. And then they go get a very solid hitting catcher, the kind of guy who the Braves occasionally would have try to find ways to get both him and Sean Murphy. That's his name, right?
That's his name.
Yeah, Jesus, why did I?
Don't wear it out.
Sean Murphy it would be reasonable for them to get d'Arnaud and O'Hoppe in the lineup. There will probably be times next year, maybe on opening day, where 2 of their 9 best hitters are Travis d'Arnaud and Logan O'Hoppe. Except they can't do that and have Mike Trout not in center field, right? I don't understand. And why are you doing this on November 14th when nobody else has signed? There have been 4 players signed to major league contracts, and 2 of them have been Travis d'Arnaud and Kyle Hendricks to the Angels. I don't understand. I don't I usually hate when people are like, why did this bad team sign this decent player when they're not going to compete? And it's because they're trying to win games.
I don't understand why d'Arnaud moved so quickly.
Construction question. Yeah.
It's not like the Angels offered him a fortune.
Yeah.
So I don't know. A little strange to me how the offseason's barely begun, so it can't say how it's playing out. But yeah, the Angels, the most aggressive team so far, clearly.
Mm-hmm. Shane McClanahan, Shane O'Mac.
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talks.
Here comes the money.
Is expected to be fully healthy entering spring training. He had Tommy John surgery back in August of 2023. That was the second Tommy John surgery of his career. I think figures to be a pretty polarizing pitcher for fantasy in 2025. The early ADP is 122.9 for McClanahan, right after Zach Gallen and Jack Flaherty, and right before Carlos Rodon and Sonny Gray. So off the top of my head, it's somewhere in the SP 25 to 35 range for McClanahan. But, We talked last week, Chris, and some people have McClanahan ranked as a top 10 pitcher for next year. So it's,
Wow.
yeah.
That's too aggressive for a guy coming back from his second Tommy John surgery. And I do want to point out, because I think everybody just looks at Shane McClanahan and says, when he's healthy, he's an ace. That hasn't quite been true. We have seen parts of 3 seasons for Shane McClanahan, significant parts of 3 seasons, basically 2/3 of 2 seasons and basically almost 1 season. He was definitely an ace in 2022. 2021 and 2023, the peripherals are not quite as impressive. 2022 is the one year where the walk rate got below 6%. It was above 7% in 2021. It was 8.7% in 2023. He had a 4.57 xERA in 2021 and a 4.10 xERA in 2023.
Chris, your mic is doing that like underwater thing.
Well, I'm just gonna talk through it. I like, clearly there is ace upside here, but I don't think there's any way you can look at Shane McClanahan coming back from a second Tommy John surgery and say, as long as he's healthy, he's a must-start pitcher. I would like to believe as long as Shane McClanahan is healthy, he's a must-start pitcher. It is not at all a guarantee based on what we've seen in his major league career and then knowing that he's coming back from a second Tommy John surgery, something that, like, there are not a lot of success stories here. Like, Jameson Taillon is one of the best double Tommy John guys.
Well, I mean, just look how it's gone for Walker Buehler.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are, like, Nathan Eovaldi, it's worked out,
Yes,
but
yeah,
it's
that's a good point.
It's a much lower success. There are successes, but it's a much lower success rate. And I hear all your points there. I only rank Shane McClanahan 42nd at starting pitcher. And when we get to starting pitcher, it's a common theme in my starting pitcher rankings. How do I have this guy ranked so low? So it's partly just a crowded position, McClanahan getting crowded out to 42. But I never would have imagined going into that process that I'd have him so low.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the Rays, Tropicana Field suffered nearly $56 million worth of damages from the hurricane, and they're hoping it can be repaired for 2026, but almost certainly will not be for 2025, and they'll likely be forced to play in a minor league ballpark, I think, all of next season. So I've heard Dunedin kind of thrown out there, and that's where the Blue Jays played a couple of years ago, the COVID year. So, yeah,
short right field fence.
We'll just have to wait and see there on Tampa Bay. Yeah. Charlie Morton plans to pitch again in 2025. I thought he was supposed to retire like 5 years ago, but he just keeps coming back. He's still okay in like a streamer sense and whatever, right matchups or something like that. The Twins may move Griffin Jacks to the rotation next season. Last 3 years as a reliever, 3.06 ERA, 103 WHIP, over 10K per 9. His strikeouts jumped way up this year. He has a 5-pitch mix. 2 of those pitches have a whiff rate over 45%. He came up as a starter originally, Griffin Jacks, but it was a really bad rookie season, and then he was great as a reliever after that. So just something to monitor, because, again, we've seen success stories in recent years with relievers turned starters.
Gino Ferris had a really good piece on this in The Athletic on Wednesday, talking about looking at relief pitchers who could make the move to the rotation. He mentioned both Griffin Jacks and Jeff Hoffman, 2 names that have been rumored to be potentially making that transition. So just worth checking that out, because we saw some success stories last year, especially.
Some early hot stove, warm stove, not really warm. Like, you're thinking about turning the stove on, but you haven't done it. I don't know. It's way too early.
Preheating it.
Yeah.
Like an oven.
Let's go with that. Apparently, the Dodgers, Red Sox, and Orioles are the most likely landing spots for Garrett Crochet. Alec Boehm is on the trade block, and Nick Pivetta is almost certainly not going to accept the qualifying offer. Back into early outfield rankings, and we've got like 10, 15 minutes left, so let's just see how many of these names we get through. Outfielders 16 to 18. Scott has O'Neal Cruz, Teoscar Hernandez, and Anthony Santander, and Chris has Christian Yelich, Anthony Santander, and O'Neal Cruz. These are names we've talked about on previous podcasts. I guess just a reminder for everyone that O'Neal Cruz was moved to the outfield toward the end of last season, and 2025 is the last time, for now, that he will have shortstop and outfield eligibility. Every year after that, we assume it'll just be outfield for O'Neal Cruz.
Yeah. And, he was a 2020 guy this past year, kind of disappointingly so, but still has all those exciting tools. He's hit the hardest ball in the majors each of the last 2 years, right? And so
the only player besides Giancarlo Stanton, I believe, to have the hardest hit ball in the majors in a season.
I really want to look at Teoscar Hernandez and Anthony Santander here for me at 17-18. And to me, they're kind of tied together. I see Chris has them separated. But to me, they are decidedly second tier in the outfield, but a very safe second tier outfielders. So they are, I like to have these demarcations in my rankings, particularly at deep positions or plentiful positions like outfield and starting pitcher, where it's so difficult to parse all these players. Above them, ending with O'Neal Cruz, are the outfielders who I think need to be drafted in the early rounds. And below them are ones I'm less sure need to be drafted in the early rounds. So I might slide Teoscar Hernandez and Anthony Santander up or down, depending on how my opinions change on players like O'Neal Cruz and James Wood above them, and below them, as we'll soon see, Michael Harris and Wyatt Langford. Maybe I slide them behind Harris and Langford as things play out and I become more confident in those two again. But that's how I view Teoscar Hernandez and Anthony Santander's placement in my rankings.
I think landing spot could have a lot to do with that as well, right, Scott? Because they're both free agents, so
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine Santander ending up in a much worse position than he was just in with the Orioles. Teoscar Hernandez could end up in a worse position, but I think there's a good chance Hernandez just returns to the Dodgers. So we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully so. Outfielders 19 through 21. Scott has Michael Harris, Wyatt Langford, and Mike Trout. And Chris has Teoscar Hernandez, Brian Reynolds, and Brenton Doyle. So some clear differences here. We didn't get to talk about Michael Harris earlier, Chris, which you had higher in your ranks at outfielder 15. So I guess now is a good time to do that. He dealt with some injury this past season, took a step back, but he also vastly underperformed his expected stats. So I kind of just want to give Michael Harris a mulligan and say, all right, let's try again in 2025. Early ADP, you're not getting any discount really on Michael Harris.
Yeah, and look, he underperformed. That underperformance was still 150 game pace of pretty close to 25 homers and 15 steals. With, surprisingly mediocre counting stats. But again, I think we all expect the Braves lineup to be better than it was last season. So I think the counting stats will be there. I'm not really that concerned about that. I think he's a very, very good bet for batting average. I think he's not a 5-category superstar in that batting average might be the only category he's actually a standout in. But I think he's at least like a B in every category. And potentially could be a lot more than that.
It's got two names here that you are higher on are Langford and Mike Trout. And, Langford, we already spoke about, mostly a letdown season, had that huge September where he hit 300 with 8 home runs, 7 steals, and a 996 OPS. And Mike Trout, you're wearing the shirt. I see that, Scott.
I am. I'm wearing his jersey here. See the
I
27?
thought that was for Joe Adele.
I thought it was Taylor Ward.
No.
Mike Trout, look, when he went down with injury, I think either at the time or towards the end of the season, we were talking about where he might get drafted this year or how many games he's likely to play moving forward. It's just, it's been a rough go for Mike Trout the past couple of years. He played a career low 29 games, and he has only played 41% of his available games over the past 4 years, and he's now 33 years old. So I don't know, Scott. I would almost bank on him playing like less than 100 games, but I don't think obviously no one knows. So
yeah, so he's tricky player to rank, obviously. for all the reasons you gave. This is by far the lowest he's ever ranked, even for me, being the one who's the highest on him, ranking him 21st in the outfield. And I decided to put him there because that's the point in the rankings where I determined that everybody left, they may have a lot of upside, but they're either volatile profiles like a Brenton Doyle, for instance, or a Lawrence Butler, let's say. Volatile, unproven profiles. Or just kind of boring, like a Brian Reynolds or a Brandon Nimmo type. And so Mike Trout is the last. Well, I have Luis Robert right behind him, so similar sort of concerns there. But you put them two together, Trout and Roberts, like they're your last chance at potentially a superstar level outfielder without taking a huge risk on profile, again, like with the Doyle or Butler, if that makes sense. That was my rationale for ranking Trout where I do. He's played only 41% of his team's games over the past 4 years, so the risk is obvious. But it is a little like Chris Sale, guy in his mid-30s, for the exact same number, actually injury-riddled years. But throughout the injuries, like Chris Sale, Mike Trout still looked like the studliness was still obvious. And so if he could just find a way to stay on the field, it was a torn meniscus that knocked him out this year.
Twice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I would say not a recurring injury, but the injury actually did recur, which is why he ended up missing the rest of the season. But you would presume he's not going to tear that meniscus again now. And that doesn't mean something else won't happen to him. Of course, that's certainly possible. But it is a little like Chris Sale's situation where just things keep happening to him. He produces when they're not happening to him, but they just keep happening to him. And you would hope his luck would turn at some point. And if it happens to turn in 2025, you're going to get a huge value, even if you follow my rankings.
Outfielders 22 through 24. Scott, you have Luis Robert, Brandon Nimmo, and Brian Reynolds. And for Chris, it's James Wood, Mike Trout, and Wyatt Langford. So all names that we've heard throughout the course of this podcast already. We didn't get to talk about Luis Robert, Chris, who you have ranked as your 14th outfielder. Scott has down at 22. I almost wonder if maybe you guys are ranking based on, like, Scott's ranking based on current situation, and Chris, maybe you're projecting a trade this offseason and just a change of scenery, which I assume would have to help Luis Robert.
I'm hoping for that. Yes. I kind of write 2024 off as just like the worst case scenario of all worst case scenarios for Luis Robert, where he's on this hopeless team. He gets hurt fairly early on. It's just like, look, we've all had days at work, weeks, months, maybe full seasons where you're like, I'm not really feeling it today. And if you were playing on the worst accounting team of all time, you were the best accountant on your team and maybe the only qualified accountant on your own team, that could take a toll mentally. And so I'm pretty much willing to write this season off for Luis Robert. I wish we had more than the 2 seasons out of 5 of him playing like a difference maker, but I know that ability is there. I know the skills are there. He still hit the ball hard when he hit the ball. I don't think he's going to be a 33% strikeout rate guy moving forward. I do think he's going to continue to run wherever he is. There aren't a lot of guys with 30-30 upside, and Luis Robert has it. And I think he's going to see one of the most dramatic lineup upgrades you could ever possibly hope for, even if he went to like the 23rd best offense in baseball. I would guess like the 23rd best offense in baseball scored, what do you think, 200 more runs than the White Sox last year? Do you think that's overselling it?
Probably not.
The White Sox had the worst. I think they scored the fewest runs in a non-strike shortened season since the 60s last year. Let's see. So the Mariners, 170 more runs than the White Sox. I slightly exaggerated, but that's what we're dealing with here.
I did not fact check this, but I saw this tweet from Codified Baseball earlier on Wednesday. Dontrelle Willis's career on base percentage was 287. The 2024 Chicago White Sox was 278.
Yeah. No, it's they like, you know how the Marlins were terrible last year, like had an awful offense, and every time a pitcher was going up against the Marlins, we'd be like, yeah, start them. The Marlins scored 130 more runs than the White Sox last year. Almost a run per game. It is impossible to overstate how bad this White Sox team was.
Well, and that's why I'm like, I'm not going to assume he's traded. There's a good chance he's traded. He has team options for 2026 and 2027, so they don't have to rush out and trade him. And if he's traded, I'll move him up, but I'll probably only move him up to the 15, 16 range, like to James Wood and O'Neal Cruz in my rankings, ahead of Teoscar Hernandez and Anthony Santander, let's say, even if he winds up in a favorable position. Luis Robert, the profile's always made me nervous. And his 2024, I feel like, earned a discount. Like, I'm happy to draft him at a discount, but if I can't get him at a discount, I don't really care to draft him, because like I want to take advantage of the discount. I think that's what his 2024 earned, but if I can't get him at a discount, it's just not worth it to me.
By the
I
way,
don't know that I expressed that as well as I hoped to. But
I do need to fact check myself.
Uh-huh.
The White Sox were the lowest scoring team in a non-strike shortened season since 1971, not since the 1960s. I apologize. It was only 53 years. I believe 1972 was a strike shortened season. So that
You really sold them short there, Chris. How could you do that?
Apologies to Jerry Reinsdorf and Chris Getz.
I'm going to quickly read off the remaining outfielders in the top 30 for each of you guys. For Scott, 25 through 30, Seiya Suzuki, Riley Green, Lawrence Butler, Spencer Steer, Brenton Doyle, and Randy Arozarena. And for Chris, it's Riley Green, Jurickson Profar, Stephen Kwan, Lawrence Butler, Ian Happ, and Seiya Suzuki. I'll throw it your guys' way if there's a name or two that you just want to quickly touch on here from that group. I just have to mention Valentine's Day may have come early, because I think I love Lawrence Butler. Power, speed, hits the ball hard, barrels it up, expected stats back up everything he did. Obviously, he went nuclear for a few months last year. Some inconsistencies, of course. He was better against lefties than he was against righties, which I love to see from a young left-handed bat. And now the hitting environment should be better. We're still waiting to learn more about the park factors, but going from Oakland Coliseum to Sacramento, I think that the environment is going to be better. So I'm in. I haven't ranked yet, but I am in on Lawrence Butler. I'll throw it your guys' way.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that, because I feel like I had trouble selling you guys on Lawrence Butler as the season was playing out. So it looks like we're all on board now. Chris and I have him ranked almost exactly the same. I was tempted to rank him higher. This was actually this stretch of the rankings was the most difficult for me in the outfield, because I was torn between how high to put the very safe but kind of boring contributors, which run 23 through 26 for me. Brandon Nimmo, Brian Reynolds, Seiya Suzuki, and Riley Green. I was torn whether to put them higher or to put the exciting but volatile and or semi-unproven outfielders, which are my next four. Lawrence Butler, Spencer Steer, I guess, kind of fits that description, but Brenton Doyle and Randy Arozarena. Do I want the exciting potential power speed threats higher, or do I want the really safe number two type outfielders higher? And I opted for safe because I was thinking about deeper leagues and not wanting to make the mistake I've often made in like a 15-team roto league, where I sell out too much for upside and don't wind up not having enough counting stats, because that volatility comes back to bite me. So I was intentionally building in a little boring in my outfield rankings by ranking them how I did. I might make an executive decision in a shallower draft, though, to just go ahead and elevate Lawrence Butler ahead of Brandon Nimmo, for instance.
My takeaway here is I'm really gonna have to move Jerkson Profar and Stephen Kwan down, just because folks are out on Profar, especially. I got at 250th overall in a draft that I'm doing right now, which I was never a big believer in Jerkson Profar, but like I think did we talk about this the other day? He's going behind
Yeah.
Taylor Ward and Elliot Ramos and Ceddanne Rafaela and like a
It's
bunch of mediocre guys. And then Stephen Kwan is a somewhat similar thing. I think I got him 175th overall. And again, I'm not like the world's biggest Stephen Kwan fan, but that just feels like a great value every time. And if I rank them 26th and 27th, I thought that was reasonable. That's like 15 to 20 spots too high at the position relative to what their ADP is. And then I'm not just going to rank based on ADP, obviously, but it's like I don't have to rank them there. So I probably won't. And I haven't started on my overalls, and there will be a lot of changes once I start to do overall rankings and, have a better sense of what the overall landscape is. But yeah, those are the two that really stand out to me, where it's just everybody hates them. And I don't really get it.
It is shocking. I mean, Taylor Ward
is
about as mid as it gets. And so I don't know why you'd settle for that rather than take a chance that maybe Profar was everything he showed he was in 2024. I understand the skepticism. I tried to rank those two specifically, Profar and Kwan. I tried to rank them as low as I could possibly justify it, because I'm not enthusiastic about drafting either next year. They're 34th and 35th for me. So they're lower than you. They're outside this top 30, but they're not nearly as low as that early ADP data shows. And, who comes after them? Cedric Mullins, Adolis Garcia, Pete Crow Armstrong, who's kind of interesting, but like very unproven. Lane Thomas. Like, it's not like you're passing up.
Yeah.
Like I said, that's as low as I could justify ranking Profar and Kwan, just looking at the caliber of outfielders left. And so I don't really understand. I think it's going to change once we get more data, once we get more platforms chiming in than just NFBC. But it is pretty shocking right now how late they're going.
Yeah, I do think both are tough to rank, as you guys have mentioned. I mean, we're coming off clear outlier seasons for both of them. I mean, Jerkson Profar, the mid-career breakout out of nowhere type season, and then Stephen Kwan, all this power out of nowhere. It's like, will that carry over again?
All of the underlying data for Jerkson Profar backs it up. That's the weirdest thing, is this is not like he had a 370 BABIP and there's no way he's like, the skills match what he did. We just don't believe in the skills. And I get that. I don't believe in the skills either. He was a top 12 player at Outfield this year, right? Or very, very close. I can't remember exactly where he finished.
Yeah.
We just recorded it 2 days ago. We should remember.
He returned $22 worth of value in a 12-team league.
And he's effectively free in a 12-team league if he's going 250. So yeah, that's one that just I wanted to call Jerkson Profar a bust. That like now I'm gonna have to come up with another name for my bust list when we write those in like February, because I can't call him a bust if he's gonna go outside the top 200.
In fact, he might even be a sleeper.
Very well, maybe. Yeah.
From bust to sleeper, Jerkson Profar right here on November 14th. You heard it here first. Last point that I want to bring up on Lawrence Butler, because of course I've got to end with a positive again on Lawrence Butler. Steamer, not that you want to put too much into projections. Again, it's early in the projections process as well. Steamer has Lawrence Butler as the 17th ranked outfielder heading into 2025. So just thought I would end with that. We are going to wrap there. For Scott and Chris, I am Frank. Thanks as always for tuning into Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. And we will be back again next week. Bye-bye.